A millionaire businessman hires a humble woman to care for his sick son, but as she gets closer to the boy, dark secrets about the family begin to emerge. Until an unexpected request from the boy completely changes the course of their lives. Clara's fingers trembled slightly as she clutched her worn leather bag, standing in front of the grand iron gates of the mansion. She hesitated, taking a deep breath, trying to calm the whirlwind of nerves swirling inside her. The imposing estate loomed before her, its marble walls gleaming in the soft afternoon light, a stark contrast to the world she knew. She had never seen anything like it up close: wealth, privilege, and power embodied in one massive structure. The scent of freshly cut grass mixed with the faintest smell of roses carried by the breeze. The air here felt different, heavier, almost oppressive. She straightened her blouse, hoping it didn't look as out of place as she felt. Clara was a mother of two, struggling to make ends meet. Every part of her wanted to turn around, to go back to the small apartment where her children were waiting. But she couldn't. They needed this. Her youngest was getting sicker, and the bills were piling up. This job, no matter how intimidating, was her chance to provide for them. She rang the bell at the gate, and a cold voice from the intercom answered. "Name?" "Clara," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm here for the interview." The gate creaked open slowly, allowing her to walk up the long, winding driveway. As she approached the front door, it opened before she could knock. A butler, dressed impeccably, stepped aside to let her in, his face expressionless. The inside of the mansion was even more overwhelming than the exterior. High ceilings, polished floors, and chandeliers that glittered like stars. Every footstep she took echoed through the vast halls. "This way," the butler said curtly, leading her through a series of corridors. They stopped at a door at the far end of a dimly lit hallway. He knocked once and opened it, revealing a spacious office where a man sat behind a large mahogany desk. Jonathan stood as Clara entered, his gaze stern, his suit sharp. He looked every part the powerful businessman, his expression revealing nothing of the man beneath. His dark hair was neatly combed, and his eyes, though focused, seemed distant. "Clara, is it?" he asked, motioning for her to sit. "Yes, sir," she replied, taking a seat on the edge of the leather chair, her hands resting tightly on her lap. Jonathan studied her for a moment, then got straight to the point. "I need someone to care for my son. He's ill, and it's a delicate situation. We've had others, but they didn't last. It's not just about his physical care. He's different." His voice softened slightly at the last word, though his face remained unreadable. Clara could tell there was a deep weight behind what he wasn't saying. "I understand," Clara said, her heart pounding in her chest. "I've worked with children before." Jonathan leaned forward slightly. "This is more than just a job, Clara. My son, David, he doesn't have much time left. And he wants to write letters. Letters to people he will never meet. I need you to help him." Clara's breath caught in her throat. She had known the boy was sick, but this. She wasn't sure if she was ready for something so emotionally heavy. Memories of her own loss flashed in her mind. Her son, lost too soon, had never had the chance to say goodbye. She could feel the familiar pang of grief settling in her chest, but she quickly pushed it aside. "I'll do it," she said softly, her voice steadying. "I'll help him." Jonathan's eyes flickered with a brief moment of relief, though his expression remained mostly unchanged. He nodded once and stood, signaling that the interview was over. "You'll start tomorrow?" Clara rose to her feet, her legs feeling slightly weak. As she followed the butler out of the room, she glanced over her shoulder at Jonathan. He stood by the window now, staring out into the sprawling garden, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. There was something in the way he stood, stiff, almost as if he were holding himself together by sheer will. She stepped out into the crisp afternoon air, the mansion looming behind her as the gates closed once again. Tomorrow, her life would change. She had taken this job out of necessity, but something deeper had already begun to stir within her. Clara arrived early the next morning, her stomach tied in nervous knots as she stood once again before the towering mansion. The gates opened slowly, and this time, the walk up the long driveway felt even heavier. Today, she would meet David, the boy whose life she had been hired to care for. A child already burdened with more than most could bear, and here she was, a stranger, stepping into his fragile world. The butler led her through the familiar grand corridors, but instead of taking her to the office, he guided her up the sweeping staircase and down another long, quiet hallway. They stopped in front of a door with delicate engravings, far less imposing than the others. The butler knocked gently before pushing it open, revealing a small room flooded with soft sunlight. Clara's eyes were immediately drawn to the large bed near the window, where a frail-looking boy lay propped up on pillows. His face was pale, his frame small and thin under the blankets, but his eyes, those bright, intelligent eyes, locked onto Clara the moment she entered. There was no fear in his gaze, no hesitation. Only quiet curiosity. "David, this is Clara," the butler introduced her briefly, before excusing himself and leaving them alone. Clara hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to begin. David spoke first. "You're the new one, right?" His voice was soft but carried a surprising strength for someone so weak. She smiled, walking closer to the bed. "I guess I am." David studied her, as if assessing whether she could be trusted. "You'll probably leave, like the others." His bluntness caught Clara off guard. "Why do you think that?" "They always do. They can't handle it when they realize I'm dying." He said the word with a strange calmness, as though he had come to terms with it long ago. Clara took a deep breath, sitting down in a chair next to his bed. "I'm not going anywhere, David." He stared at her for a long moment, then nodded slightly, as if deciding to give her the benefit of the doubt. "Good," he said quietly. "Because I need you to help me with something important." Clara felt a pang in her chest, but she pushed it aside. "I'm here to help, whatever you need." David reached for the notebook beside him, his frail fingers brushing against the cover. "I want to write letters," he explained, his eyes darkening with a seriousness far beyond his years. "Letters to people I'll never meet." Clara was silent for a moment, unsure of how to respond. It was such a heavy task for a child, but David wasn't like most children. His illness had forced him to grow up far too quickly. "I can help with that," she said softly. "Who are these letters for?" David smiled faintly, the first sign of warmth she had seen from him. "For my sister. The one I'll never meet." Clara's heart tightened. Jonathan had mentioned wanting another child, but the plans had been put on hold because of David's illness. To hear David speak of this unborn sibling so knowingly was heartbreaking. "Do you want to start now?" she asked, her voice gentle. David nodded, handing her the notebook. Clara opened it, noticing how pristine the pages were. It seemed as though he hadn't written anything yet. She picked up a pen and positioned herself, waiting for him to begin. "Dear sister," David started, his voice steady, though his eyes seemed distant, as if picturing a life he would never get to see. "I hope you get to do all the things I never could. I hope you run, laugh, and feel the sun on your face every day." Clara wrote each word carefully, feeling the weight of every sentence. David's words carried a depth that seemed to come from a place of profound understanding, an acceptance of his fate that no child should ever have to reach. "I'm not afraid to leave," David continued, his tone calm and clear. "But I'm sad I won't get to know you. If Dad ever tells you about me, I hope he tells you I was strong. And that I loved him, even if he didn't always know how to love me back." Clara's hand paused for a moment at that last sentence. There it was, David's quiet confession of the emotional distance he felt from his father. She glanced at him, but his face was unreadable, his focus solely on the words he was dictating. "Tell Dad to live," David said, his voice softer now. "Tell him not to be afraid to feel things after I'm gone. He's always so afraid." Clara swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion, but she continued to write. When David finished, he leaned back against the pillows, his eyes tired but content. "Thank you," he murmured, his eyes fluttering shut as the exhaustion from even that brief effort took over. "We'll write more tomorrow?" Clara placed the notebook back on the table beside him, her mind racing with the gravity of what had just happened. She had only just met David, but already, the depth of his words and the task before her weighed heavily on her heart. As she quietly left the room, she couldn't shake the image of his small figure against the massive backdrop of the mansion, a child carrying the wisdom of someone far older. The next morning, Clara returned to the mansion with a sense of determination she hadn't felt in years. The gravity of David's request the day before had stirred something deep within her, something that went beyond her need for a job or financial stability. She felt an odd sense of responsibility, not just for the boy's physical care, but for his emotional needs, for ensuring that his final words carried the weight and meaning he intended. As she entered David's room, she noticed him sitting up slightly, the morning light filtering through the curtains and casting a warm glow over his pale skin. He greeted her with a small smile, but his eyes seemed more tired than the day before. "Good morning," Clara said softly, taking her usual seat by his bedside. "Morning," David replied, his voice faint but steady. "I've been thinking about the letters." Clara nodded, waiting for him to continue. She could tell by the way he stared out the window that he had been lost in thought, perhaps reflecting on the things he wished to say, the people he wanted to reach. "I want to write to my dad," he said after a moment, his voice carrying a weight that made Clara pause. "Are you sure?" she asked gently, knowing how complicated David's relationship with his father seemed to be. David nodded. "He needs to hear it, even if I won't be around when he does." Clara swallowed hard, understanding the significance of what David was about to do. Jonathan, despite his wealth and power, seemed helpless when it came to his son's illness. His emotional distance was palpable, and Clara knew that David felt it too. David gestured for the notebook, and Clara handed it to him, watching as he carefully opened it to the next blank page. He hesitated for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts, before speaking softly. "Dear Dad," he began, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "I know we don't talk about the things that matter. Maybe it's because you're afraid, or maybe it's because I am. But there are things I need to say, things I won't have the chance to say later." Clara's hand moved quickly as she transcribed his words, the weight of each sentence pressing down on her. David's honesty was raw, unfiltered. He spoke with a clarity that only someone facing the end could possess. "I know you've done everything to try to keep me here," David continued, his voice softening. "And I love you for that. But Dad, you need to know that it's okay to let go. It's okay to feel things, real things. Not just the business deals, the meetings, and the responsibilities. I need you to feel what's happening right now." Clara glanced at David as he spoke, his face calm, though his eyes betrayed a deep sadness. She wondered how many times he had wanted to say these things to his father but had never found the words or the opportunity. "I want you to live, Dad," David said, his voice growing quieter. "Not just after I'm gone, but now. I want you to love people, to let them in. Don't be afraid to feel things, even if it hurts." David stopped, his breathing shallow as the effort of speaking began to take its toll on his fragile body. Clara waited, her heart heavy with the realization of what this letter meant for both father and son. When David finally spoke again, his voice was barely a whisper. "Tell him I'm not afraid, and that he shouldn't be either." Clara finished writing, the room falling into a heavy silence as David closed his eyes and leaned back against the pillows. For a moment, the only sound was the soft rustle of the curtains as the breeze filtered in through the window. "Do you want to add anything else?" Clara asked gently, her own voice thick with emotion. David shook his head, his eyes still closed. "No. That's enough for today." Clara nodded, placing the notebook carefully on the table beside his bed. As she left the room, she couldn't help but feel the weight of David's words pressing down on her, knowing that Jonathan had no idea of the emotional storm that was building just beyond his reach. The days passed slowly, and with each new morning, Clara found herself growing more attached to David. Their routine became a steady rhythm, conversations that dipped between letters and memories, laughter that was soft but genuine, and moments of silence that carried more weight than words could express. David's fragile body may have been failing, but his spirit remained strong, and Clara felt an undeniable connection forming between them. This particular morning, Clara found David sitting up in bed, a small, knowing smile on his face. There was a quiet strength about him that day, something that hinted at an inner peace he had found. "You're early today," David remarked as she entered the room. "I guess I couldn't wait to see what new wisdom you have for me," Clara teased, sitting in her usual chair by his bedside. David chuckled softly, his eyes twinkling with amusement. "You think I'm wise?" "I think you're wiser than most adults I know," Clara admitted, her tone more serious now. "You see things that others miss?" David glanced out the window, his smile fading slightly. "Maybe that's because I don't have much time left to see things." Clara's heart clenched at his words, but she didn't let it show. David had always been blunt about his situation, never one to shy away from the reality of his illness. It was a trait that both impressed and saddened her, this young boy forced to confront the hardest truths of life while others his age worried about trivial things. "I've been thinking about more letters," David said after a moment of silence. "But not just for my family. For friends I never had." Clara frowned slightly, unsure of what he meant. "Friends you never had?" David nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I didn't really get to have friends. Being sick all the time, I missed out on things like playing with other kids, going to school, stuff like that. But I'd like to imagine what it would have been like. I want to write to them." Clara's breath caught in her throat. David's imagination, even in the face of such a harsh reality, was astonishing. The idea of writing letters to friends he had never known, friends he wished he could have had, was both beautiful and heartbreaking. "That's a wonderful idea," Clara said softly, feeling the weight of his words. "What would you say to them?" David closed his eyes for a moment, as if envisioning the world he had missed out on. "I'd tell them what I wish we could have done together. Running in the park, going on adventures, playing games, things I never got to do." He opened his eyes again, looking at Clara with a quiet resolve. "I don't want to be remembered as just the sick kid. I want to be remembered as someone who could have been a good friend." Clara felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them back, not wanting to show her emotions. David's words were filled with a sense of longing, not just for life itself, but for the connections he had been denied because of his illness. "Let's start then," Clara said, picking up the notebook. "Who do you want to write to first?" David smiled faintly, as though he had already imagined these friends in his mind. "Dear friend," he began, his voice steady. "I wish we could have met when things were different. I imagine we would have done all kinds of fun things together. I would have laughed more, maybe even been a little braver. Clara wrote quickly, her hand moving across the page as David's words flowed. He spoke with such clarity, such vivid imagination, that it felt as though he were truly writing to someone who had existed in his life. I hope that wherever you are, David continued, you have someone like me to call a friend. Someone who will stick by you, even when things get hard. I think I would have been that kind of friend. When David finished, Clara placed the notebook down, her chest tight with emotion. His resilience, his ability to envision a world beyond his illness, left her in awe. You already are that kind of friend, David, Clara said softly, her voice thick with emotion. Even if you never got the chance to meet them? David smiled at her, a quiet, peaceful smile that seemed to say he knew it, too. And in that moment, Clara realized that the bond they had forged was more than just caregiver and patient. It was something deeper, something that would stay with her long after the letters had been written. Clara had been spending more and more time with David, and their bond had deepened in ways she hadn't expected. The letters they wrote together became a sanctuary for both of them, a place where David could express his thoughts, dreams, and fears, and where Clara found herself sharing in his journey. But the growing connection between them didn't go unnoticed. Jonathan had become increasingly distant, though he was always present in the background. He rarely joined them in David's room, preferring to stay buried in his work or consulting doctors about new treatments, no matter how improbable. Clara sensed the tension that hung in the air whenever Jonathan was near, his inability to confront the reality of his son's condition, coupled with his unease at the closeness between Clara and David. One evening, after Clara had finished her day, she was called to Jonathan's office. The tone in the butler's voice was different, sharp, urgent. Clara's heart raced as she made her way down the dimly lit corridor, the weight of an impending confrontation heavy on her chest. When she entered the office, Jonathan was standing by his desk, a piece of paper clutched tightly in his hand. His face was pale, his jaw clenched. Clara instantly recognized the paper. It was one of the letters David had written, the one addressed to his father. "I found this," Jonathan said, his voice low, almost trembling with anger. Clara swallowed hard. She hadn't expected him to discover the letter so soon, and certainly not like this. "David wanted to write to you," she began, choosing her words carefully. Jonathan cut her off, his voice rising. "And you encouraged him? You let him believe that writing these letters is going to change something?" He slammed the paper down on his desk, his hands shaking. Clara took a step forward, her heart pounding. "He's trying to connect with you, Jonathan. He's trying to say things that he doesn't have the strength to say in person. These letters, they're his way of reaching out. Reaching out." Jonathan snapped, his eyes flashing with a mixture of anger and pain. "He's giving up. And you're helping him do it?" Clara stood her ground, her voice calm but firm. "No, Jonathan. He's not giving up. He's accepting what's happening to him, and he's trying to make peace with it. You're the one who's afraid to accept it." Jonathan flinched at her words, his face contorting with a mix of denial and frustration. He turned away, pacing to the window, his hands gripping the back of the chair so tightly his knuckles turned white. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the ticking of the clock on the wall. "I've done everything for him," Jonathan said quietly, his back still turned to Clara. "Every doctor, every treatment. I've spent millions trying to keep him alive, trying to save him. And now you want me to sit back and let him die?" Clara's heart ached for him. Beneath the anger, she could see the raw, unprocessed grief that Jonathan was carrying. He wasn't ready to face the truth that his son had already come to terms with. He wasn't ready to let go. "He doesn't need you to save him, Jonathan," Clara said softly, stepping closer. "He needs you to be with him. Right now. While there's still time." Jonathan shook his head, his shoulders trembling. "I can't. I don't know how to." Clara paused, feeling the depth of his struggle. "You can. You just have to stop pretending that you're in control of this. You're his father, Jonathan. That's what he needs from you now, not the businessman, not the man who can fix things with money. He needs his dad." Jonathan remained silent, staring out the window at the darkened garden outside. His posture was tense, but Clara could sense the cracks forming in the walls he had built around himself. After what felt like an eternity, Jonathan finally turned around, his eyes glassy with unshed tears. "I don't know how to do this," he whispered, his voice raw. Clara's gaze softened. "You don't have to know. You just have to be there. That's enough." For a long moment, Jonathan said nothing. The tension in the room seemed to hang in the air like a thick fog, neither of them knowing what to say next. But Clara could see the shift in him, the realization that perhaps, for the first time, he couldn't control the outcome. And that scared him more than anything else. Finally, Jonathan nodded, his expression weary. "I'll try," he said quietly, as though the words themselves were foreign to him. Clara exhaled softly, relieved that he had finally started to lower his guard. She knew it wouldn't be easy for him, but this was the first step. David needed his father now more than ever, and Jonathan, despite all his fears, was beginning to understand that. As she left the office that night, Clara couldn't shake the image of Jonathan standing alone by the window, a man torn between his love for his son and the crushing reality of losing him. But for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope that Jonathan would find the courage to be the father David needed in his final days. The next morning, Clara approached the mansion with a different sense of anticipation. After her confrontation with Jonathan the night before, she wasn't sure what to expect. Would he retreat back into his shell of denial, or had her words pierced through the thick walls he'd built around himself? Either way, today felt like a turning point, and Clara could only hope that Jonathan would find the strength to be there for David. As she entered the house, the air inside felt unusually still, as though the whole place was holding its breath. The butler greeted her with a curt nod, and she made her way up the familiar stairs to David's room. When she pushed open the door, she was surprised to see Jonathan already there, sitting quietly by David's bedside. The sight took her by surprise. Jonathan, who had so often kept his distance, now sat close to his son, his posture tense but present. David, still propped up against his pillows, looked up at Clara with a faint smile, his pale face lighting up ever so slightly. "You're here early," Clara said softly, taking her usual seat on the opposite side of the bed. She glanced at Jonathan, who gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. "I wanted to spend more time with him," Jonathan said quietly, his voice rough but sincere. It was a simple statement, but Clara could hear the weight of it, his decision to finally be there for David, despite the fear that still lingered in his eyes. David, for his part, didn't seem surprised. He looked between Clara and his father with a calm acceptance, as though he had been waiting for this moment all along. "Dad's helping me with today's letter," David said, his voice soft but steady. He held up the notebook, which now rested on his lap. "We're writing it together." Clara's heart swelled at the sight of them. She had hoped Jonathan would come around, but seeing him sitting beside David, ready to participate in his son's final wishes, was more than she could have imagined. "That's wonderful," Clara said gently, giving David an encouraging smile. "Who's this one for?" David's eyes met his father's for a brief moment before he spoke. "It's for you, Dad," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Jonathan's expression tightened, and for a moment, Clara thought he might falter. But he didn't. Instead, he reached out and placed a hand on the notebook, steadying it for David as the boy began to speak. "Dear Dad," David began, his voice trembling slightly but full of quiet strength. "I know you don't like to talk about the hard stuff. Neither do I, really. But I need you to hear this." Jonathan's grip on the notebook tightened ever so slightly, and Clara saw his throat bob as he swallowed hard. "I'm not scared, Dad," David continued. "I don't want you to be scared either. I need you to promise me something, that after I'm gone, you'll live. Not just for me, but for you too. You deserve that." Jonathan's jaw clenched, and Clara could see the struggle in his eyes. He was fighting back tears, his body stiff with the weight of what his son was asking of him. David hesitated for a moment, his breath shallow, before continuing. "I want you to let people in. Don't shut yourself off from the world, okay? There's so much out there that's worth living for, even when it hurts." Clara watched as Jonathan's face crumpled, the walls he had spent so long building finally giving way. A single tear escaped the corner of his eye, and he quickly wiped it away, as though embarrassed to show such vulnerability. But it was too late, David had already seen it, and Clara could see the relief in his son's eyes. "I promise," Jonathan whispered, his voice breaking. "I promise I'll try." David smiled, a small, peaceful smile that seemed to say everything without needing to say a word. He leaned back against the pillows, his eyes closing briefly as he let out a contented sigh. Clara felt a lump in her throat as she watched father and son share this quiet, intimate moment. She knew that Jonathan's promise wasn't just for David, it was for himself, too. It was the first step toward healing, toward living the life David so desperately wanted him to embrace. As the room fell into a comfortable silence, Clara gently closed the notebook and placed it on the table beside the bed. She stood up quietly, giving the two of them some space. Jonathan needed this time with his son, and for once, he wasn't running from it. Before leaving the room, Clara glanced back at them, Jonathan sitting at his son's side, his hand resting protectively on the notebook, and David, calm and peaceful, content in the knowledge that his father was finally with him in the way he needed most. For the first time, Clara felt a sense of hope, fragile but real, that Jonathan might find a way to keep his promise. The air in the mansion felt heavier as the days went on. Clara could sense it in the quietness of the hallways, in the way Jonathan moved more slowly, as though every step weighed on him. David's condition was worsening, his once vibrant spirit now battling the fatigue that came with each passing day. The letters, once filled with dreams and wishes for a future he wouldn't see, were now becoming more urgent, more personal. One morning, as Clara entered David's room, she immediately noticed the change in him. His breathing was shallow, and his face looked even paler than before. Yet, his eyes were as bright as ever, focused and determined. "Clara," David called out softly as she approached his bed. "I need your help." Clara sat down beside him, her heart tightening at the sight of his frail body. "Of course, David. What is it?" He took a deep breath, struggling to gather his strength before speaking. "I want to write one last letter." He glanced at his father, who sat quietly in the corner of the room, his face etched with worry. "And I want Dad to help me again." Jonathan straightened at David's words, his expression both tense and tender. "What do you want to say, David?" Jonathan asked, his voice thick with emotion. David looked between Clara and his father, and then he closed his eyes for a moment as though gathering his thoughts. When he opened them again, his voice was soft but clear. "This one's for me," David said, a small smile playing on his lips. "I want to write to myself." Clara felt a lump form in her throat. She glanced at Jonathan, whose face reflected a mixture of confusion and sorrow. "To yourself?" Jonathan asked, his voice barely a whisper. David nodded. "Yeah, you know, a message to myself for when I'm gone. Something to remember me by, I guess." Clara swallowed hard, her heart breaking at the depth of David's understanding of his own mortality. Jonathan, too, seemed to be struggling to keep himself composed, his eyes glistening as he nodded in agreement. Clara picked up the notebook and pen, her hands trembling slightly as she prepared to write. "Okay, David," she said gently. "Tell me what you want to say." David hesitated for a moment, then began to speak, his words soft and deliberate. "Dear David," he said, his voice carrying a quiet strength. "I know things didn't turn out the way you hoped. You didn't get to live the life you imagined. But you were brave. You faced everything that came your way with courage, even when it was hard." Clara wrote quickly, her heart heavy with each word. Jonathan, sitting close by, leaned forward, his eyes never leaving his son's face. "And you loved?" David continued, his voice faltering slightly. "You loved Dad, even when he didn't always know how to show it. You loved life, even when it hurt?" Jonathan's head dropped into his hands, his shoulders shaking as the weight of his son's words overwhelmed him. Clara paused for a moment, giving Jonathan a chance to gather himself, but David continued, his eyes filled with a strange kind of peace. "I want you to remember that," David said softly. "You mattered. You were here. And even though it wasn't for long, you made a difference." Clara's hand trembled as she finished writing the letter, her eyes misting with tears. She glanced at Jonathan, whose face was now wet with silent tears, his grief raw and uncontainable. But there was something else there too, something like pride, like love, finally breaking through the walls he had kept up for so long. David, exhausted from the effort, leaned back against his pillows, his breathing labored but his expression peaceful. "That's it," he whispered, his eyes fluttering shut. "That's all I wanted to say." Clara set the notebook aside, her heart aching as she watched Jonathan reach for his son's hand. He held it tightly, his fingers trembling as he whispered, "I'm so proud of you, David." "So proud?" David smiled faintly, his eyes barely open. "I know, Dad. I know." The room fell into a deep, still silence, the weight of David's final request hanging in the air. Clara quietly stood up, feeling the need to give father and son their moment together. She stepped out of the room, closing the door softly behind her, her heart heavy with the knowledge that this was likely the last letter David would write. The finality of it all settled over Clara as she walked down the hall, the sound of her footsteps echoing. The following morning, Clara woke with a sense of quiet dread. The weight of David's final letter lingered in her mind, and the realization that his time was nearly over made the air feel thick around her. As she approached the mansion, the world seemed quieter than usual, as if holding its breath. Inside the house, there was no usual bustle from the staff, no movement, just an eerie stillness that Clara felt deep in her chest. When she reached David's room, the door was slightly ajar, and the scene inside told her everything she needed to know. Jonathan sat by David's bedside, his hand still clutching his son's, though David lay perfectly still now. His chest no longer rose and fell with the shallow breaths Clara had grown accustomed to. His face, though pale, was peaceful, his final letter to the world complete. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she quietly entered the room. Jonathan's face was wet with tears, but there was a strange calm about him, as though he had finally accepted what he had been so afraid of for so long. He didn't turn to look at her but kept his focus on David, his hand never leaving his son's. "I was here," Jonathan said softly, almost to himself. "I stayed with him." Clara nodded, tears welling in her eyes. She didn't need to say anything. There were no words that could ease the pain of losing a child, no words that could fill the emptiness that now hung in the air. But she was grateful, at least, that Jonathan had been there, that David had not been alone. She moved quietly to the small table where the notebook lay, the letters David had written now complete. She picked it up gently, holding it as if it were the most precious thing in the world. And in many ways, it was. These letters were David's legacy, his way of leaving something behind for those he loved, even when he couldn't be with them. "Would you like me to read it?" Clara asked softly, glancing at Jonathan. She wasn't sure if he was ready, but she felt it was something David would have wanted, for his father to hear his final words, to understand the depth of what he had left behind. Jonathan nodded, his eyes red and swollen, but he didn't speak. Clara opened the notebook to the last letter, the one David had written to himself. "Dear David," Clara began, her voice trembling slightly. "You were brave. You faced everything that came your way with courage, even when it was hard. You mattered. You were here." Jonathan closed his eyes, fresh tears spilling down his cheeks as Clara read the final lines. "You made a difference?" As the words hung in the air, Clara closed the notebook gently, setting it down beside Jonathan. The room felt different now, still full of grief, but also a sense of peace. David's final message had been heard, his legacy left in the hands of those who loved him most. For the first time, the mansion didn't feel so empty. David's presence lingered, not in body, but in the letters, in the memories, and in the hearts of those he had touched. In the weeks that followed David's passing, the mansion remained eerily quiet, as if the house itself were mourning his absence. Clara continued her visits, though her role had shifted. She no longer cared for a sick child, but for a grieving father, a man who was learning, step by painful step, how to live in a world without his son. Jonathan had changed. The cold, distant businessman who had once hidden behind walls of denial and control had given way to someone more vulnerable, someone more human. He no longer shut himself off in his office or buried himself in work. Instead, he spent time in the garden where David used to look out from his window, as though searching for a connection to his son in the living things that grew there. One morning, as Clara arrived at the mansion, she found Jonathan sitting outside on a bench, the notebook of David's letters resting in his lap. His face, though still marked by grief, seemed softer, more at peace. He looked up as Clara approached, and for the first time, there was a faint smile on his lips. "I've been thinking," Jonathan said quietly, his voice calm yet filled with emotion. "About what David wanted, about what he left behind." Clara sat down beside him, waiting for him to continue. She knew that the letters had become his way of staying connected to David, of keeping his memory alive. Every page held a piece of his son, and Jonathan had read them countless times, searching for meaning, for a way forward. "I want to do something with these letters," Jonathan said after a long pause. "Something to honor him, to keep his legacy alive." Clara looked at him, her heart swelling with admiration. "What do you have in mind?" Jonathan hesitated for a moment, as though the weight of the decision still hung in the air. "A foundation," he said finally. "For children like David. Families going through what we went through. I want to share his letters, not just with me, but with the world. Maybe it'll help others, help them know they're not alone." Clara's eyes filled with tears. It was a beautiful idea, one that felt so right, so fitting for David's memory. "He would love that," she said softly. "He wanted to make a difference. And through those letters, he will?" Jonathan nodded, his eyes misting over as he looked down at the notebook in his hands. "I want the world to know who he was. Not just the sick boy, but the boy who had so much love, so much wisdom." The two sat in silence for a while, the warm breeze rustling the leaves around them. The sadness was still there, and always would be, but there was something new too, a sense of purpose, of hope. David's words, his letters, would live on, touching lives in ways that Jonathan had never imagined possible. As the days passed, Jonathan moved forward with the creation of the foundation, pouring his energy into something that honored his son's legacy. Clara stayed by his side, helping in any way she could. The mansion, once a symbol of isolation and loss, began to transform into a place of healing, a place where David's spirit, and his words, could continue to touch the lives of others. David's legacy wasn't just in the letters he left behind. It was in the way he had changed those around him, in the way his quiet strength and love had brought healing to a father who had once been lost, and in the way his final words would offer comfort to those who needed it most. In the end, David's letters became more than just words on a page. They became a testament to life, to love, and to the power of connection, even in the face of the greatest loss. Years had passed since David's letters first made their way into the world, yet their impact only grew. The foundation that Jonathan had created in his son's memory became a beacon of hope for families struggling with illness and grief. It wasn't just about the money or the resources, it was about the words, the deeply personal letters David had written, which now inspired others to express their own feelings and connect with loved ones in ways they hadn't before. Clara remained an integral part of the foundation, having become more than just a caregiver. She was a bridge between the memory of David and the people who sought solace through the foundation's work. Her quiet strength, compassion, and deep understanding of loss made her an invaluable guide for others going through the unimaginable. One afternoon, Clara found herself standing in front of a group of parents at a small gathering organized by the foundation. The event was simple, families coming together to talk, to share their experiences, and to write letters of their own. It was a tradition now, inspired by David's letters. Clara looked out over the crowd, her heart full as she saw parents and children writing, speaking softly to one another, connecting in ways that David had dreamed of. As she spoke to the group, she held David's notebook in her hands. These letters, Clara began, her voice steady but filled with emotion, were never meant to be just words on a page. They were David's way of making sure that we don't forget to love, even when it's hard. To open up, even when we're afraid. And most importantly, to remember that we're not alone. The parents nodded, their faces reflecting the deep truth in her words. Clara had seen firsthand how loss could isolate people, how grief could shut them off from the world. But she had also seen the other side, the way that sharing, connecting, and opening up could heal, could bring people back to life even in the midst of loss. After the gathering, as Clara packed up the materials, she felt a familiar presence beside her. Jonathan stood there, watching her with the same quiet respect he had come to show over the years. He was no longer the broken man she had first met, though the grief of losing David still lived within him. But now, it was a part of him, a part that had helped him grow, that had taught him how to live fully in ways he hadn't before. "I think David would be proud," Jonathan said softly, his voice filled with emotion as he looked around the room at the families who had come to honor his son's memory. Clara smiled, her eyes misting as she nodded. "He would. He'd be proud of all of this." Jonathan's gaze softened, his gratitude clear in the way he looked at Clara. "I couldn't have done any of this without you, Clara. You were there when I couldn't be. You gave him something I never could, peace." Clara felt the familiar ache in her heart but also the warmth that came from knowing they had all found their way through the darkness, together. As they walked toward the exit, leaving the gathering behind, Clara took one last look at the notebook in her hands. It wasn't just a collection of letters, it was a legacy, one that continued to grow with each new family that came to the foundation. David's words, though simple, had become a light that guided so many through their own grief, offering hope and a reminder that, even in the face of loss, there is always love. David had left the world too soon, but his legacy lived on, carried forward by the people who had loved him most. So, what about you? If you had the chance to leave behind a message to someone important in your life, what would you say? How would you express the love, the gratitude, or even the regrets that have shaped your relationships? David's letters remind us that even in the face of loss, our words can live on, making a difference in the lives of those we cherish. Click the video on the screen to continue this journey of self-reflection and discover how expressing your feelings now can change the course of your relationships. And if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe for more stories that inspire, challenge, and help you connect more deeply with yourself and others. Let's continue this journey together.